In a school filled with politicians' children, business heirs,
girl?
and daughters of men who owned half the buildings downtown, nobody noticed the quiet girl with ocean blue eyes
I've always wondered
until the
how
day
someone this
everything
broke got into
changed.
this university.
She never spoke about her family. She never explained where she disappeared to on weekends, or why her phone was 3 years old, or why she flinched slightly whenever someone asked about her father. She simply existed at the edges of every room, calm, unreadable, untouchable in her own quiet way. But on this particular afternoon, that would end. One of the wealthy students deliberately knocked her books from her arms, laughing as she struggled to pick them up. Minutes later, black luxury cars surrounded the university entrance, and someone was about to learn that every action has consequences. Before we continue, tell me in the comments where you're watching from today. Now let's get into the story. The corridor outside the lecture hall was crowded, students moving in loose clusters between classes, voices overlapping, phones held up, laughter bouncing off the tall windows. Pearl Carter walked close to the wall, her bag strap gripped in one hand, her eyes fixed somewhere ahead of her, rather than on any of the faces around her. She almost made it past them. Soo-jin stood near the notice board with 3 of her friends. Sunglasses pushed up into her hair despite being indoors. A designer bag hanging from her shoulder. She saw Pearl first. Her mouth curved. "Isn't that the scholarship girl?" One of her friends laughed under her breath. Pearl kept walking, her pace unchanged, her expression flat. Soo-jin stepped sideways. Just enough. Her shoulder caught Pearl's bag strap. The bag swung, the zipper already loose from age, and Pearl's notebook slid out onto the floor, along with a folder of loose papers. Her laptop bag tipped open beside them. Pearl stopped. She looked down at her things scattered across the tile. "Oops," Soo-jin said, not sounding sorry at all. Pearl crouched down and began gathering the papers, stacking them against her knee. Around her, a few students slowed their walking, glancing over, then continuing on, unwilling to get involved. "You know," Soo-jin said, crouching slightly so her voice would carry down to where Pearl knelt. "I've always wondered how someone this broke got into this university. Your phone still has a cracked screen. Your bag is falling apart. Is your mom cleaning houses to pay for this?" Pearl's hand paused over a notebook. She didn't answer. "That's actually kind of sad," Soo-jin continued, straightening back up. "Coming here every day, sitting next to people whose families own half the city, pretending you belong." One of Soo-jin's friends nudged a textbook further away with her shoe, just out of Pearl's reach. Pearl reached for it anyway, her jaw tightening, her fingers closing around the cover. She stood up slowly, her arms full, her chin lifted just enough to meet Soo-jin's eyes. "Why do you enjoy this?" Pearl asked. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Humiliating people. Does it feel good?" Soo-jin's smile didn't waver. "You make it easy." For a moment, neither of them moved. The hallway noise continued around them, indifferent. Students passing, none of them slowing down long enough to see how close Pearl's hands were to shaking. Then, outside, a low engine sound cut through the noise of the courtyard beyond the glass doors. A black car, long and polished, rolled to a stop directly in front of the main entrance. 2 more cars pulled in behind it. Students near the windows turned to look. The driver's door of the lead car opened first. A man stepped out, tall, dressed in a plain dark suit, and immediately opened the rear door. A second man stepped out from the back seat. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, his dark hair combed back neatly. His suit was black, tailored close, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone. Tattoos climbed the side of his neck, disappearing beneath his collar, visible again along the backs of his hands as he adjusted his cuff. His expression was unreadable, calm in a way that felt deliberate rather than relaxed. 2 more men stepped out behind him and stayed a pace back, their eyes moving across the courtyard, across the windows, across the students who had stopped to stare. Nobody in the hallway knew who he was. But every single person watching understood, without being told, that this was not an ordinary visitor. "Who is that?" someone near the doors murmured. The man walked directly toward the entrance. He didn't check his phone. He didn't glance at the building signage. His eyes moved once across the crowd inside the glass doors and found exactly what he was looking for. He pushed the door open. The hallway noise dropped, not all at once, but in a ripple, conversations trailing off as students turned to watch him walk. His steps were unhurried. His eyes stayed fixed ahead of him. He walked past Soo-jin without looking at her. He stopped in front of Pearl. Pearl's arms were still full of scattered papers. Her mouth opened slightly. Her eyes went wide. "Pearl?" he said. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Dad?" The word landed in the hallway like something dropped from a height. Soo-jin's smile disappeared. Her friends exchanged a glance. Students nearby who had barely registered the scene a moment ago now stood frozen, staring. He looked down at the papers still in Pearl's arms, then crouched without a word, and began picking up the ones that had fallen furthest, straightening them against his palm, before handing the stack back to her. His movements were careful, unhurried, as if the hallway full of watching strangers didn't exist. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, his eyes on her hands. Pearl shook her head. "No, I'm fine." He studied her face a moment longer than the answer required. Then he stood, adjusted the folder under her arm so it sat more securely, and looked toward Soo-jin for the first time. Soo-jin straightened her shoulders instinctively, though she couldn't have explained why. He said nothing to her. He simply turned back to Pearl. "Come with me." Pearl hesitated, glancing at the hallway, at the dozens of eyes now fixed on her, at Soo-jin standing motionless near the notice board. "Dad, I have class in 10 minutes. "I know," he said. "This won't take long." He placed a hand lightly at her shoulder, guiding her forward rather than pulling her, and began walking back toward the entrance. Pearl fell into step beside him, her papers held against her chest, her eyes lowered. As they passed the group near the doors, one of the men who had stayed near the entrance leaned slightly toward him and said, low enough that only those closest could hear, "Boss, everything is arranged for this afternoon." Soo-jin, standing several feet away, heard it clearly. "Boss." Her eyes followed the man's back as he walked Pearl out through the glass doors and into the courtyard, toward the waiting car. Her friends had already begun whispering beside her, but Soo-jin didn't hear a word of it. She was still staring at the empty doorway, replaying the single word in her mind, feeling something cold settle low in her stomach that she couldn't yet name. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had seemed possible. Pearl Carter's mornings began the same way they always had, quiet and unremarkable. She woke before her alarm, made tea for herself and her mother, and left for the university on foot, unless the weather made that impossible. She wore the same 3 jackets in rotation. Her phone, cracked along one corner of the screen, sat in her bag rather than in her hand, because she had long ago learned that carrying it visibly only invited comments. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most striking students on campus. Her eyes were an unusual pale blue that seemed to shift depending on the light, inherited from a grandmother she had never met. Her features carried both her mother's softness and something sharper, more angular, from a father she rarely spoke about. Students noticed her. They simply didn't know what to do with what they noticed, because Pearl gave them nothing to build a story around. No designer bags, no boyfriend paraded through the courtyard, no family name anyone recognized. She liked it that way. At home, the apartment she shared with her mother was small but carefully kept, warm in a way that had nothing to do with money. May Carter had chosen every piece of furniture herself, patiently, over years, and the result was a home that felt lived in rather than staged. May worked long hours at a design firm downtown, and in the evenings she and Pearl often sat together at the small kitchen table, sharing a pot of tea, talking about nothing important. It was during one of those evenings, weeks before the hallway incident, that Pearl's phone rang. She glanced at the screen, then answered it, her voice shifting into something warmer than her usual tone. "Hi, Dad." May, seated across the table, said nothing, but her hands slowed over the dish she was drying. "I'm fine," Pearl said into the phone. "Just finished dinner with Mom." A pause. "No, I didn't skip lunch today." Another pause. And this time Pearl's mouth curved into a small smile. "I know. I promise." She listened for a while, occasionally answering a question, occasionally laughing softly at something said on the other end. May watched her daughter's face during these calls more than she listened to the words, because Pearl's face changed completely when she spoke to her father. The careful neutrality she wore everywhere else fell away. "Okay," Pearl said eventually. "I'll call you tomorrow. Get some sleep." A brief silence. Then, quieter. "I love you too." She set the phone down on the table. May finished drying the dish in her hands before she spoke. "How is he?" "Busy," Pearl said. "He always is." "Did he ask about school?" "He asks about everything." Pearl picked up her tea, wrapping both hands around the cup. "He wanted to know if the professor I complained about last week apologized yet." May smiled faintly, but there was something careful behind it, the way there always was when Min Jae came up in conversation. "He remembers things like that. He remembers everything," Pearl said. "Sometimes I think he remembers things I've forgotten I told him." May set the dish towel down and came to sit across from her daughter. For a moment, she simply looked at her, at the eyes that weren't hers, at the sharper line of the jaw that had come from somewhere else entirely. "He loves you very much," May said finally. "You know that?" "I know." Pearl turned the cup slowly between her palms. "I just wish—" She stopped herself. "What?" Pearl shook her head slightly. "Nothing. It's fine." May reached across the table and covered her daughter's hand with her own. She didn't press further. There were things about Min Jae that Pearl understood only in fragments, pieces gathered over 19 years from careful phone calls and rare visits, and the particular way people's faces changed whenever his name came up in certain rooms. May had never explained the full truth to her, not because she didn't trust Pearl, but because some truths were heavier than a daughter needed to carry before she was ready. "Your father loves you," May said again, quieter this time, "but his world isn't one you need to enter." Pearl looked up at her. "I know, Mom. You've told me that since I was little." "I know I have." May squeezed her hand once before letting go. "I'll keep telling you." Min Jae Kang did not visit often. When he did, it was rarely at the apartment, and never for long. He preferred to call, to send drivers when Pearl needed to be somewhere at night, to have gifts delivered that Pearl usually declined with a polite message and, occasionally, accepted with visible reluctance when he insisted. But he called every single day, not out of habit, out of something closer to necessity, as if the sound of her voice confirmed something he needed confirmed daily. On the calls Pearl never saw, the ones that happened after she'd hung up and gone to bed, Min Jae sat in an office on the top floor of a building whose ownership was buried under 4 different holding companies, and he was an entirely different man. Men twice her age lowered their eyes when he entered a room. Deals were made or ended based on a single word from him. His name, spoken carelessly in the wrong part of the city, had ended careers, and in a few documented instances, considerably more than careers. None of that existed when Pearl answered the phone. "How was your exam?" he asked her one evening, his voice low, measured, nothing like the tone he used with the men standing at the far end of his office. "I think I did fine," Pearl said. "I was more worried about the second question than I needed to be." "You always are." A pause. In the background of his end of the call, someone said something too quiet for Pearl to catch, and Min Jae answered without lowering the phone, his voice sharpening for exactly 1 sentence before returning to its previous warmth. "Sorry, what were you saying?" "Nothing important. Just that I'm relieved it's over." "Good." Another pause. "Did you eat today?" Pearl exhaled, half amused. "Yes, Dad. I'm asking because last week you told your mother you'd eaten, and then admitted to me 2 days later that you hadn't. That was one time. It was enough times. His voice hadn't risen at all, but there was something underneath it, careful and immovable. Eat properly. I don't ask you for much, Pearl. She smiled slightly at that, alone in her room, twisting the edge of her blanket between her fingers. You ask me for a lot, actually. Only because I worry. You worry too much. I have earned the right to worry as much as I want. She laughed quietly at that, and on his end of the call, in an office where grown men would not have dared laugh in his presence, Min Jae allowed the corner of his mouth to lift, just slightly, just for her. I have to go, Pearl said eventually. I have reading to finish. All right. A brief silence. Pearl. Yeah? If anything happens, he said, his voice dropping lower, more deliberate. Anything at all, you tell me first. Not your mother. Not your friends. Me. Something in his tone made her pause. Why would you say that? No reason. The warmth returned to his voice almost immediately. Smooth. Practiced. Just tell me. That's all I'm asking. Okay, she said slowly. I will. She wouldn't. Not for weeks. Not until there was no longer any way to avoid it. But she didn't know that yet. And neither did he. Not fully, though something in him had already begun to suspect that his daughter was hiding more than tiredness behind her voice. The bullying didn't begin all at once. It built, the way these things usually do, one small cruelty at a time, each one easy enough to dismiss on its own. It started with Soo-jin commenting, loudly enough for others to hear, on the crack running across Pearl's phone screen during a lecture break. It continued a week later when Pearl was left off a group project list, her name simply not included, despite having signed up on time, the professor later informing her the oversight had been corrected by other students without her knowledge or consent. It continued again when Soo-jin, during a lunch period, asked in front of a full table whether Pearl's mother had considered a second job, since university fees weren't cheap, and Pearl's clothes suggested money was tight. Pearl said nothing to any of it. She adjusted her seat. She corrected the group project error quietly, through the professor, rather than through confrontation. She ate her lunch, simple as it was, without acknowledging the comment. It escalated further when a rumor began circulating that Pearl's scholarship had been granted on false financial information, that her mother had lied about their income to secure aid she didn't need. Pearl heard the rumor secondhand from a classmate who clearly hadn't expected her to overhear. Then came the photograph. Someone had taken a picture of Pearl eating alone in the courtyard, a simple rice dish packed from home, and posted it with a caption mocking the modesty of the meal compared to the expensive lunches other students carried. It had been shared enough times that Pearl saw it twice before she made it to her afternoon class, both times from classmates who quickly closed the app when they noticed her looking. She said nothing about any of it at first. She simply grew quieter at home, her answers to May's questions shorter, her appetite smaller. May noticed before Pearl said a word. Something's wrong, May said one evening, setting down her fork. You've been picking at your food for a week. Pearl hesitated. It's nothing serious. Pearl, she set her own fork down slowly. There's a girl at school, Soo-jin. She's been... Pearl paused, searching for the right way to say it. She's been making things difficult. Comments, rumors, nothing physical. May's expression tightened, though she kept her voice calm. What kind of comments? About money. About mom working herself into the ground to afford my tuition. About my phone, my clothes. Pearl shrugged, an attempt at indifference that didn't quite land. It's fine. I can handle it. May was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was careful. You haven't told your father. No. Good. The word came out faster than May intended, sharper. She caught herself and softened it. I mean, don't. Not yet. Pearl frowned slightly. Why not? May looked down at her plate, then back up at her daughter, choosing her next words with visible effort. Because you know what your father is capable of when someone hurts you. The kitchen went quiet. Pearl studied her mother's face, searching for something in it she didn't fully have the language to name yet. What does that mean? Pearl asked. It means, May said, reaching for her daughter's hand across the table. That some problems are better solved without him knowing the details. Not because he doesn't love you, because he loves you too much to be reasonable about it. Pearl didn't push further that night, but the words stayed with her, turning over quietly in the back of her mind through the following days, even as the bullying continued, even as she kept it from the one person whose voice on the phone each evening had begun to feel like the only steady thing in her week. She didn't know yet that keeping it from him wouldn't matter for much longer. He was already coming. The morning after the hallway incident, the university felt different, though most students couldn't have said exactly why. Pearl arrived to find small clusters of people breaking apart the moment she walked past. Phones lowered quickly, voices dropping to whispers that stopped entirely when she got close enough to hear. By mid-morning, she understood why. A classmate she barely knew approached her near the library entrance, phone already in hand. "Is it true your dad is Min Jae Kang?" Pearl stopped walking. "Where did you hear that name?" "It's everywhere," the girl said, turning her screen toward Pearl. A grainy photograph filled the display, an older image, Min Jae standing outside a building Pearl didn't recognize, his expression cold, two men flanking him. Beneath it, a thread of comments speculated wildly, throwing around words like syndicate and enforcer and untouchable. Pearl said nothing. She turned and walked into the library without answering, her chest tight, her hands curled into fists at her sides. By the time she reached a table near the back, her phone had already begun buzzing with messages from numbers she didn't recognize, people she'd never spoken to, suddenly eager to reintroduce themselves. She turned the phone face down and pressed her palms flat against the table, breathing slowly. Across campus, in a quieter corner near the courtyard, Soo-jin sat with her friends, though she hadn't said much since they'd gathered. One of them was reading aloud from an article on her phone, something about disappearances linked loosely to Min Jae's name, businesses that had changed hands overnight, men who had crossed him and were never seen in the city again. "This can't be real," one of the friends said, though her voice lacked conviction. "It has to be some other Min Jae." Soo-jin said nothing. She was thinking about the crouched figure gathering Pearl's scattered papers off the floor, the careful way his hands had moved, the single word one of his men had used. "Boss." Soo-jin. One of the girls nudged her. "You okay?" "I'm fine," Soo-jin said, though her voice came out flatter than she intended. She wasn't fine. She was replaying every comment she'd made in the past month, every insult about Pearl's clothes and her mother's income, and her cracked phone screen, turning each one over and finding it suddenly, sickeningly stupid. She had spent weeks mocking a girl whose father could apparently make people disappear from the city, and she had done it in front of witnesses, in hallways, in group chats that could be screenshotted and circulated. She put her phone face down on the table and didn't pick it up again for the rest of the afternoon. Min Jae found out everything within 2 days. It wasn't difficult. He had men whose entire job was gathering information quietly, and once he'd asked the right question, the details arrived quickly and completely, laid out on his desk in a folder by early evening. Screenshots of messages. The photograph of Pearl eating alone in the courtyard, a timeline of incidents stretching back nearly 2 months. He read through all of it without speaking. The man who had delivered the folder stood near the door, watching his employer's face for some sign of the reaction that was coming. It didn't come the way he expected. Min Jae closed the folder slowly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam his hand against the desk. He simply sat very still for a long moment, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the folder in front of him. "Get me a car," he said finally. "Boss, it's late. Now." He arrived at Pearl and May's apartment 40 minutes later, unannounced, his men waiting outside by the car rather than following him up. May opened the door and immediately stepped back to let him in, her expression already bracing for something. "You know," Min Jae said, before she'd even closed the door behind him. "Min Jae, you knew, and you told her not to tell me." His voice was low, controlled, but there was something underneath it that made May fold her arms across her chest, as if bracing against a cold wind. 2 months, May. 2 months of it, and I found out from a folder on my desk instead of from either of you. I asked her not to tell you because I knew exactly how you'd react, May said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Look at you right now. You drove here in the middle of the night the second you found out. Because someone hurt my daughter. And what were you going to do about it? Show up at the school with 4 men and a look on your face that terrifies grown adults? Min Jae's jaw tightened further, because the answer was closer to yes than he wanted to admit. From the hallway, Pearl's voice cut through the tension before either of them could continue. Dad! Both of them turned. Pearl stood in the doorway of her room, still in the clothes she'd worn to campus that day, her arms crossed loosely over her chest. You knew? She asked quietly. Min Jae's expression shifted the moment he looked at her, the hardness in his face softening slightly, though it didn't disappear entirely. I know everything now. The comments, the photograph they circulated, all of it. Pearl's eyes dropped briefly before lifting back to his. It wasn't that bad. Don't do that. His voice was firm but not sharp. Don't minimize it for me. She walked further into the room, stopping a few feet from him. Up close, she could see the tension still sitting in his shoulders, the effort it was clearly taking him to keep his voice even. What are you going to do? She asked. What do you think I should do? Pearl hesitated. She knew, in a way she couldn't fully explain, that the honest answer to that question involved consequences far beyond what any university disciplinary committee could hand out. She had grown up catching fragments of her father's world, enough to understand that his patience had limits most people never got to test. I don't want you to destroy anyone, she said finally. The room went quiet. Min Jae studied her face for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Pearl, I mean it, she said, cutting him off gently. Whatever you're thinking about doing to that girl, or her family, I don't want it. I can handle people being cruel to me. I've been handling it. I don't need you to handle it for me in the way you handle things. Something moved behind his eyes. Something that looked almost like pain. He was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again, his voice lower now, softer. Do you know how hard it is, he said slowly, to sit in a room 300 kilometers away and know someone is hurting you and do nothing? Pearl's throat tightened. I didn't want you to know because I didn't want you to feel that. I'd rather feel it than not know at all. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair back from her face, his hand lingering there for a moment before dropping back to his side. You don't have to protect me from your pain, Pearl. That's not how this works. Then don't do anything extreme, she said. Please. He was quiet for a long time. When he finally answered, his voice had settled into something calmer, though the promise underneath it was unmistakably firm. I won't touch her. I won't touch her family. But the university will handle this properly. And if they don't, I will make sure they understand why that's a mistake. Pearl exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Okay, he repeated, then quieter, almost to himself. Okay. He stayed another 20 minutes, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table May had chosen years earlier, asking about her classes in a voice that had returned almost completely to its usual warmth, though his eyes kept drifting toward her hands, as if checking for some injury he hadn't yet found. Before he left, he stood at the door and looked at her for a long moment. Call me tomorrow, he said. Not because I'm asking, because I need to hear that you're all right. I will. He nodded once, then turned and left, his men falling into step behind him as he walked to the car. May watched from the window until the taillights disappeared down the street. He kept his word tonight, May said quietly, more to herself than to Pearl. He always does with me, Pearl answered. The university's response came swiftly, and with considerably more urgency than similar complaints usually received. Within 3 days, Soo-jin had been called into the dean's office, informed in careful, formal language that a formal record of her conduct would remain on file, and required to issue a written and verbal apology to Pearl in the presence of a faculty mediator. Soo-jin sat across from Pearl in a small meeting room, the mediator positioned between them, a folder of printed messages and screenshots laid out on the table. For the first time since Pearl had known her, Soo-jin looked genuinely uncertain, her usual composure absent, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I'm sorry," Soo-jin said, her voice quieter than Pearl had ever heard it. "For everything. The comments, the photo, all of it. It was cruel, and I shouldn't have done any of it." Pearl studied her for a long moment. "Why did you do it?" Soo-jin's eyes flicked to the mediator, then back to Pearl. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Soo-jin was quiet for a moment, then exhaled slowly. "You never seemed to need anything from anyone. You didn't care what people thought of you, and I couldn't figure out why. Everyone around us is constantly trying to prove something, and you just weren't. It made me angry, I think. I don't have a better explanation than that." Pearl absorbed this without responding immediately. There was no triumph in hearing it, no satisfaction, just a quiet, tired understanding. "I accept your apology," Pearl said finally, "but I'm not going to pretend the last 2 months didn't happen." "I understand," Soo-jin said. They didn't speak again after the meeting ended, walking out of the room in opposite directions without another word between them. But something had shifted, subtle and unspoken, though neither of them could have named exactly what. It was nearly 2 weeks later that Min Jae saw Soo-jin again, this time from a distance, standing near the university gates waiting for a car. He hadn't intended to notice her specifically. He was there to collect Pearl for a dinner he'd insisted on, one of the rare evenings he cleared his schedule entirely for her. But something about the girl standing near the gates caught his attention and held it. It wasn't her face. Not exactly. It was the way she stood, weight shifted onto one hip, arms crossed loosely, chin tilted at a particular angle while she waited. Something about the posture struck him as familiar in a way he couldn't immediately place. An echo of someone he hadn't thought about in years. He watched her for longer than he meant to, before Pearl appeared beside the car, pulling his attention away. "Dad?" Pearl followed his gaze toward the gates. "What are you looking at?" "Nothing," he said, though his eyes lingered a moment longer before he opened the car door for her. "Get in. You're going to be late for your own dinner." He didn't mention it again that evening, but later that night, alone in his office long after Pearl had gone home, he found himself pulling up an old contact he hadn't touched in years. Someone whose job was to find people quietly and thoroughly. "I need information on a family," he said, when the call connected. "The mother's name is Jin." There was a pause on the other end. "Do you have a last name, boss?" Min Jae was quiet for a moment, his eyes fixed on nothing in particular. "No," he said finally, "but I remember her face well enough. Find her." He hung up without further explanation, sat back in his chair, and stared at the ceiling for a long time, the posture of a girl standing by a gate replaying in his mind, refusing to leave him alone. The information came back 3 days later, delivered to Min Jae's office in a single folder, thinner than most of the files that crossed his desk. He opened it alone, late in the evening, after everyone else had left the building. The first page held a photograph of a woman in her early 40s, her hair shorter now than he remembered it, her face carrying 2 decades he hadn't witnessed. Beneath the photograph, a name, Jin. Min Jae sat very still. He hadn't seen that face in 19 years. He had spent a long time convincing himself he no longer needed to. She had disappeared from his life the way certain people disappear from certain kinds of lives. Quietly, without confrontation, without explanation he'd ever demanded loudly enough to receive. He had told himself, for years, that she'd simply grown tired of what he was becoming and left before it swallowed her too. He turned the page. The second sheet listed a daughter, 19 years old, a student at the same university Pearl attended. Soo-jin Han. Min Jae read the name twice, then a third time. His hand, resting flat against the desk, curled slowly into a fist. He thought of the posture at the gate, the tilt of the chin, the particular way she'd stood with her weight on one hip, arms crossed. waiting. He closed the folder and sat in the dark office for a long time without moving. He confronted Hae-jin 2 days later, arranging the meeting through an intermediary rather than appearing at her door unannounced. A small mercy he told himself he owed her, though he wasn't certain why. She met him at a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, choosing the location herself, a place unlikely to attract attention. When she saw him walk in, her hands, already wrapped around a cup of tea, went still. Min Jae, her voice came out barely above a whisper. He sat across from her without any greeting. Why did you disappear? Hee-jin's eyes dropped to the table. You know why. I don't actually. I've spent 19 years assuming you simply stopped wanting the life that came with me. His voice was low, controlled, though something underneath it strained against the calm. Tell me the real reason. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tightening around the cup. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely steady. I was pregnant. The cafe noise around them continued, indifferent. Cups clinking. A espresso machine hissing somewhere behind the counter. Min Jae didn't move. What did you say? I found out 3 weeks after I left. Hee-jin's eyes lifted to his. Glassy now, though she didn't let the tears fall. I was pregnant, Min Jae. And by then, you had already become someone I couldn't imagine bringing a child into. The stories I'd started hearing, the men who came looking for you at odd hours, the way people's faces changed when they said your name. I panicked. I left before I even knew for certain, and by the time I found out, I told myself it was better this way. Min Jae's jaw was tight, his hands flat against the table, pressed down as if to keep them from shaking. Where is she? Hee-jin looked away. Where is she? Hee-jin? You already know, she said quietly. You wouldn't be sitting here otherwise. Min Jae closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, something in his expression had hardened, though his voice remained low. Soo-jin, Hee-jin nodded once, unable to speak. You let her grow up thinking she had no father. His voice cracked slightly on the last word, an unfamiliar sound coming from him. 19 years, Hae-jin. I have a daughter I've known about for 4 days. I was trying to protect her, Hae-jin said, her voice rising slightly, desperate now. I was trying to protect both of us. From what? From me? From what you'd become. She wiped quickly at her eyes. I made a mistake keeping her from you. I've known that for years. I just never found the courage to fix it. Min Jae sat back slowly, staring past her, out through the cafe window at nothing in particular. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he had no immediate action to take, no clear next step, no situation he could simply solve through force or money or fear. He had a daughter who had spent 19 years insulting another daughter he'd raised, with everything he had, and neither girl had any idea they shared blood. I need a DNA test, he said finally. Before anything else happens, I need to be certain. Hee-jin nodded. I understand. The test confirmed what neither of them had truly doubted. 3 days later, sitting alone in his office with the results in front of him, Min Jae read the percentage twice, then set the paper down and pressed both hands against his face. He had spent 19 years protecting one daughter from every hard edge of his world. He now had another he'd never known existed, and she had spent the last 2 months hurting the first. He told Pearl on a Sunday afternoon, choosing the apartment rather than anywhere more formal, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table where so many of their conversations had happened over the years. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need you to let me get through all of it before you say anything. Pearl set down her cup slowly, reading the tension in his face. Okay, he told her everything, from the beginning, from a relationship that had ended before she was born, from a pregnancy he'd never known about, from a folder that had arrived on his desk with a face he hadn't seen in 19 years attached to it. Pearl listened without interrupting, her expression shifting slowly from confusion to something closer to disbelief, as the pieces began arranging themselves. You have a sister, he said finally. Pearl blinked. What? Soo-jin. He watched her face carefully as he said the name. She's my daughter. The DNA test confirmed it 3 days ago. Pearl sat completely still. For a long moment she said nothing at all, her mind working through the shape of what he'd just told her, turning it over, refusing at first to fully land. "You're telling me Soo-jin is my sister?" she said slowly. "Yes. The same Soo-jin who spent 2 months humiliating me, who mocked my phone and my clothes and mom's income. That Soo-jin." "Yes." Pearl's eyes filled slowly, though she didn't look away from him. "That's my sister." "Pearl." "No. I heard you." Her voice cracked slightly. "I just need a second." He didn't reach for her, didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance. He simply sat across from her and let her have the moment, understanding, better than most, how much weight a single sentence could carry. When Pearl finally spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I'm not upset because she's your daughter. I'm upset because she hurt me. And the whole time she was doing it, we were already family, and neither of us had any idea." "I know," Min Jae said softly. "I know exactly what you mean." Pearl wiped quickly at her eyes, more frustrated than embarrassed by the tears. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," he said. "I'm not going to force anything. Not a relationship with her, not forgiveness, none of it. You get to decide how much of this you want in your life." Pearl was quiet for a long time, staring down at her hands. "Does she know yet?" "Not from me, not yet." "Tell her," Pearl said finally. "She deserves to know the truth, even if it's complicated, even if it doesn't fix anything right away." Min Jae studied his daughter for a long moment, something proud and pained moving across his face at once. "You're a better person than most people give you credit for." "I'm just tired of secrets," Pearl said quietly. "Everyone in this story has been keeping one." Soo-jin learned the truth from her mother 2 days later, sitting in the same living room she'd grown up in, staring at her mother's face as the pieces of her entire life rearranged themselves in front of her. "Min Jae Kang is my father," she repeated slowly, as if saying it aloud might make it easier to believe. "Yes," Soo-jin said quietly. "And Pearl is his daughter too." "Yes." Soo-jin sat back against the couch, her hands pressed flat against her knees, staring at nothing. "So the girl I spent months humiliating is my sister." Haejin didn't answer, because there was nothing to say that would soften it. "Why didn't you tell me?" Soo-jin's voice rose, sharper now. Years of unasked questions finally finding an outlet. 19 years, Mom. You let me grow up thinking my father just didn't want me. Do you have any idea what that did to me?" "I was afraid," Haejin said, her voice breaking. "I was afraid of what his world would do to you if you were part of it. I was afraid of losing you to that life." "You didn't protect me," Soo-jin said, standing now, her voice trembling. "You took my family away from me before I even had a chance to know them." She left the house that evening and didn't return until well past midnight, walking for hours through streets she barely registered, replaying every cruel thing she'd ever said to Pearl, every insult about money and clothes, and a mother who worked herself thin. All of it aimed at a girl who had turned out to be her own blood. She went to Pearl 3 days later, finding her outside the university library in the late afternoon, sitting alone with a book she wasn't really reading. "Can we talk?" Soo-jin asked. Pearl looked up, closing the book slowly. "Sure." Soo-jin sat down across from her, her usual composure entirely absent, her hands twisting together in her lap the way they had during the formal apology weeks earlier. Except this time, there was no mediator, no folder of evidence, nothing but the two of them and the truth sitting between them. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Soo-jin said. "I just needed you to know that I understand now. What I did to you, before I even knew who you were, I was cruel, because I was insecure and jealous, and I hated that you never seemed to need anyone's approval. It wasn't about money or clothes. It was about the fact that you seemed complete in a way I wasn't, and I couldn't stand it." Pearl listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. "I'm not asking you to be my sister overnight," Soo-jin continued. "I just want the chance to earn something. Anything." Pearl was quiet for a long moment. "You're my sister," she said finally. "That's not something either of us gets to choose. But what happened between us doesn't disappear just because we share a father. You hurt me, Soo-jin, repeatedly. That doesn't erase." "I know. So if you want something real with me, it's going to take time, not an apology in a hallway." "Time?" Soo-jin nodded, tears finally slipping down her face. "I can do that." They didn't hug. They didn't declare anything resolved. Pearl simply reopened her book, and after a moment, Soo-jin remained sitting there beside her, saying nothing further, and neither of them asked the other to leave. Months passed before anything between the two girls resembled comfort. Soo-jin stopped surrounding herself with the friends who had once amplified her cruelty, stopped chasing the approval of people who valued designer bags over character. She sat with Pearl sometimes now, not every day, not without awkward silences, but often enough that other students had begun to notice the shift and stopped asking questions about it. Min Jae remained, to everyone outside a small circle, exactly what he had always been: feared, untouchable, a name spoken carefully in certain rooms. But at the small kitchen table in May's apartment, where he now visited more often than he ever had before, he was simply their father, asking about exams, correcting Soo-jin's posture the same way he once corrected Pearl's, listening to two very different daughters talk over each other about classes and professors and small daily grievances. One evening, sitting together after dinner, Pearl looked across the table at him. "Do you think we'll ever have a normal family?" she asked. Min Jae considered the question for a moment, glancing between his two daughters, one who had spent 19 years without him, one who had spent 19 years knowing him only through phone calls and careful visits. "Probably not," he said. Pearl laughed, and beside her, Soo-jin added, "Especially with you." Min Jae looked at both of them for a long moment, something settling in his chest that even his own reputation couldn't have predicted for him. For the first time in years, the most feared man in the city had built, without meaning to, something that had nothing to do with fear at all. There is a simple truth beneath everything that happened to Pearl, to Soo-jin, and to the father who nearly lost the chance to know one of them entirely. Cruelty often comes from wounds we refuse to look at honestly. Soo-jin didn't hate Pearl for being poor. She hated watching someone stand steady in themselves while she herself felt hollow underneath every expensive thing she owned. And Hae-jin didn't hide a daughter out of malice. She hid her out of fear, and fear, left unexamined for long enough, can cost people years they never get back. The people we dismiss, the ones we decide we already understand, from a glance at their shoes or their phone or their quiet corner of a room, often carry entire worlds we know nothing about. And the people we resent most fiercely are sometimes closer to us than we could ever imagine. Kindness costs nothing. Assumptions cost everything. If this story moved you, let us know where you're watching from, and stay a little longer, because there are more stories like this one waiting for you right here.